I decided to surprise my wife at the country house I'd given her 3 years ago. At the gate, a man I'd never seen before stopped me and said the words that would shatter my world. "I'm sorry, sir, but the owner has already arrived." Through the wrought iron bars, I could see another man standing on my porch, tall, silver-haired, moving with the casual authority of someone who belonged. The afternoon sun caught the expensive weave of his sweater as he gestured to a delivery crew, directing them like a conductor leading an orchestra. My orchestra. My porch. My house. Let me back up. My name is Demetrio Thomas, and at 55 years old, I thought I understood my life. 23 years of marriage to Kathleen had given me 2 grown children, Scott working in London and Courtney pursuing her PhD at Stanford, and what I believed was a solid partnership. Sure, we'd grown distant lately. What couple doesn't after the kids leave? But I never imagined this. The drive from Boston had taken 3 hours through Vermont's autumn glory, roads painted in brilliant oranges and reds that should have filled me with peace. Instead, I'd spent the whole drive rehearsing what I'd say to Kathleen. We needed to reconnect. I'd been too absorbed in my financial consulting work, too quick to dismiss her complaints about feeling invisible. This surprise visit was supposed to be my olive branch. The man at the gate was still waiting for my response, one hand resting on the iron bars with practiced ease. He looked to be in his mid-30s, fit, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. James Rodriguez, according to the embroidered name on his work shirt. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully, studying his face for any flicker of recognition. "I'm Demetrio Thomas. I own this property." James's expression didn't change. No embarrassment, no apology, just a slight furrow of confusion. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas are here for a private weekend. They specifically requested no interruptions." Mr. and Mrs. Thomas. The words hung in the October air like smoke. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as my mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. A mistake at the county recorder's office? Identity theft? Some kind of elaborate prank? Through the gate, the silver-haired man turned toward us, and even from this distance, I could see his confident smile. He waved at James with the easy familiarity of an employer acknowledging staff. My staff, on my property. Something cold and calculating clicked into place in my mind. The same analytical detachment that had made me successful in risk assessment for 3 decades. If I revealed who I was, if I forced my way in with legal documents and righteous anger, I might never learn the truth. Whatever was happening here had been carefully constructed. The only way to understand it was from the inside. "You're absolutely right," I said, forcing an apologetic smile. "I think I may have gotten turned around. I'm actually looking at properties in the area, thinking of buying something for weekend getaways. This place is exactly what I had in mind." James's demeanor shifted immediately, the suspicious edge melting into helpfulness. "Oh, well, I'm afraid this property isn't for sale, sir. The Thomases are very happy here." Of course, I said, my mind racing ahead. "But you know how it is. Sometimes people change their minds if the price is right. Would it be possible to speak with them, just to express my interest?" I watched him weigh the decision, glancing back toward the house. The fact that he needed to consider it told me everything about the power dynamics here. This wasn't his call to make. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose there's no harm in asking, but I should warn you, they're quite attached to this place. It's been in the family for years." "In the family for years?" The lie slid off his tongue so smoothly that I almost believed he believed it. How many times had Kathleen fed him this fiction? How carefully had she constructed this alternate reality where I simply ceased to exist? "I understand completely," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Family properties are special, but you never know. Sometimes circumstances change." James nodded and stepped back toward the intercom mounted on the gatepost. As he pressed the button, I caught another glimpse of the man on the porch. He'd been joined by someone else now, a woman in a flowing dress, her dark hair catching the light. Kathleen. My wife moved around the porch with the same grace that had first attracted me 24 years ago, laughing at something the silver-haired man said. There was an ease between them, an intimacy in the way she touched his arm that made my stomach turn. "Miss Thomas," James spoke into the intercom, "there's a gentleman here interested in the property. Says he might want to make an offer." A pause. Then Kathleen's voice crackled through the speaker, warm, welcoming, utterly unfamiliar in its brightness. How wonderful. Send him up to the house. Richard and I would be happy to chat with him. Richard. The gate began its mechanical swing open, the same sound I'd heard hundreds of times before. But this time, instead of coming home, I was entering enemy territory with a false name and no idea what I'd find inside. As I drove up the gravel driveway, I took in the changes. The flower beds I'd paid to have professionally designed had been completely redone. New sculptures dotted the lawn, modern pieces that looked expensive. Even the trees seemed different, more manicured, as if the property itself had been remade in someone else's image. A sleek black Mercedes sat in the circular drive, its pristine condition suggesting a price tag north of $150,000. I parked my modest Lexus beside it, the contrast embarrassingly obvious. Richard appeared on the porch before I'd even turned off the engine. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6'2", with silver-gray hair styled with professional precision and a tan that spoke of recent vacations in expensive places. His cream-colored cashmere sweater probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. When he smiled, it was the practiced expression of someone accustomed to making good first impressions, someone who'd perfected the art of inspiring trust. "You must be our potential buyer," he called out, striding down the steps with his hand extended. "Richard Thomas, welcome to our little slice of paradise." Richard Thomas. He'd taken not just my wife, not just my house, but my last name as well. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the expensive Patek Philippe watch on his wrist that probably cost $80,000, the confident way he held eye contact just long enough to convey sincerity without aggression. "David Morrison," I replied, pulling the false name from somewhere deep in my shocked brain. "Thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice." "Not a problem at all," Richard said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Kathleen and I were just discussing how this property has such good energy that it practically sells itself. Come on up to the house. She's preparing some coffee." He turned and walked toward the front door, my front door, with the casual ownership of someone who'd walked that path 1,000 times. I followed, noting how he paused to straighten a planter that had shifted slightly, how he automatically held the door open with the muscle memory of routine. This wasn't recent. Whatever this was had been going on for a long time. The interior of the house hit me like a physical blow. Everything had been transformed since my last visit 6 months ago. Gone were the neutral tones and simple furniture Kathleen and I had chosen together. Instead, the living room was decorated in rich burgundies and golds, with artwork I'd never seen before, hanging on walls I'd paid to have painted. Expensive Persian rugs covered the hardwood floors I'd had refinished 3 years ago. But it wasn't just the decor, it was the feeling of the space itself. The house felt lived in, settled, as if 2 people had been building a life here together for years. Family photos sat on the mantelpiece, photos that featured Kathleen and Richard in various poses of domestic bliss. Hiking together, cooking together, laughing together on the very porch where I now stood as an unwelcome stranger. The frames were expensive, the photos professional quality, the whole display carefully curated to tell a story of a perfect marriage. "Kathleen, darling," Richard called toward the kitchen, "our visitor is here." She appeared in the doorway, and for a moment my breath caught. At 50, Kathleen was still beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than when I'd married her. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a flowing dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine about country living. But it was the expression on her face that nearly broke me. She looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. When her eyes met mine, there wasn't even a flicker of recognition. No shock, no guilt, no fear. She looked at me the same way she might look at any stranger who'd wandered into her perfect life. "You must be David," she said, moving forward with her hand outstretched. "I'm Kathleen Thomas. Richard told me you're interested in the property." I took her hand, the same hand that had worn my wedding ring for 23 years, though now it bore a different band entirely, and managed to find my voice. "That's right. I hope you don't mind me saying, but you have the most beautiful home I've ever seen." Her face lit up with genuine pride. "Thank you so much. Richard and I have put a lot of love into this place. It's been our sanctuary for the past few years." The past few years, not months. Years. Please, sit down, Richard said, gesturing toward a sofa I'd never seen before, one that probably cost more than my car. Kathleen makes the most incredible coffee. We get the beans specially imported from a little farm in Guatemala. As they moved around each other in the living room, I watched their interactions with a mixture of fascination and horror. There was an easy intimacy between them, a natural rhythm that spoke of countless mornings spent together, countless evenings sharing this space. Richard's hand found the small of Kathleen's back as she passed him. She automatically straightened his collar when she noticed it was slightly askew. These were the unconscious gestures of a couple deeply comfortable with each other. "So, David," Kathleen said as she settled into my favorite reading chair, the one I'd bought from an antique shop in Cambridge 7 years ago. "What draws you to this area? It's rather off the beaten path." I'd prepared for this question during the drive up from the gate. "I'm recently retired," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd been thinking about it. "I've been looking for somewhere peaceful to write my memoirs. The isolation appeals to me." "How wonderful," she said, and I could hear genuine enthusiasm in her voice. "What sort of work were you in?" "Finance," I replied, choosing something vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. "Corporate consulting, mostly. Nothing very interesting." Richard leaned forward with interest. "You know, that's exactly the kind of background this area could use more of. Too many of the old families have let their properties run down because they don't understand modern financial planning." The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard was sitting in my house, wearing my wife's attention like a comfortable sweater, lecturing me about financial planning. "The previous owner was exactly that type," Kathleen added, settling back with her coffee cup cradled in her hands. "A sweet man, but completely impractical when it came to money matters. He bought this place as some sort of investment, but he never really understood how to maintain a property like this." Previous owner. I gripped my coffee cup tighter, using the heat to keep my hands from shaking. "What happened to him?" I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. Richard and Kathleen exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that couples develop over time. "Divorce," Kathleen said with a slight shrug. "His wife finally got tired of his financial irresponsibility and took him to the cleaners. Poor man had to sell everything just to pay the settlement." The room spun slightly around me. In her version of events, I was the failed husband. I was the one who'd been left behind, the one who'd lost everything. She'd rewritten our entire history to make herself the victor in a story I didn't even know we were writing. "That's unfortunate," I managed to say. "It really was," she continued, warming to her subject, "but it worked out perfectly for Richard and me. We'd been looking for exactly this kind of property for months. The timing was almost too good to be true." "Almost like it was meant to be," Richard added, reaching over to squeeze her hand. As I sat there watching my wife of 23 years smile lovingly at another man in the house I'd bought for her, while she told stories about my own demise, something crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. I was sitting in the middle of the most elaborate lie I'd ever encountered, and the woman I'd loved for more than half my adult life was its architect. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Kathleen asked, rising from her chair with practiced grace. "Richard's done some wonderful renovations since we've been here." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Every room would be another knife twist, another reminder of how thoroughly I'd been erased, but I needed to see it all. I needed to understand the scope of what had been done to me. Richard led the way, his hand naturally finding the small of Kathleen's back. "We've really tried to honor the original character of the house while making it more functional for modern living," he explained. The moment we stepped into what had been my home office, I felt the blood drain from my face. My desk, the antique mahogany piece I'd inherited from my grandfather, still sat by the window, but everything else had been transformed. My books were gone, replaced by volumes on art history and wine collecting. My filing cabinets had been replaced with an elegant credenza holding crystal decanters. "This is Richard's study," Kathleen said proudly. "He's quite the collector of rare books." Richard moved behind my grandfather's desk with casual ownership. As he gestured toward architectural drawings spread across the surface, I caught sight of something that made my heart stop. Partially visible beneath the renovation plans was the corner of a document with my name on it. Not David Morrison, but my real name, Demetrio Thomas. "The previous owner left quite a bit of paperwork behind," Richard was saying. "Legal documents, property records, that sort of thing. We've been meaning to have it all properly disposed of, but you know how these things go." The casual way he said it, as if discarding the evidence of my existence was just another household chore, nearly broke my composure entirely. "You know," I said, moving slightly closer to the desk, "I'm always curious about the legal side of property acquisitions. Was this a complicated transfer?" Richard's expression brightened with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed talking about his accomplishments. "Actually, it was surprisingly straightforward once we got all the documentation sorted out. The previous owner's divorce settlement required him to liquidate his assets quickly, so he was motivated to sell." As he spoke, he casually shuffled papers, and I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be my signature in blue ink on a document I'd never seen before. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Could I trouble you for your restroom?" "Of course," Kathleen said immediately. "Down the hall, second door on the right. Same place it's always—" She caught herself, but not quickly enough. For the first time since I'd arrived, uncertainty flickered across her face. Richard's eyes sharpened slightly, but he covered with a smooth laugh. What Kathleen means is that old houses like this tend to have very predictable layouts. I excused myself and took a detour past what had been our bedroom. The door was ajar. Inside, everything had been transformed. Expensive furniture, Richard's clothes in the closet I'd built with my own hands, Kathleen's jewelry on the vanity I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. But what stopped me cold was the photo on the dresser. Our wedding photo, except I'd been carefully cut out, just Kathleen in her wedding dress, smiling at empty space where I used to stand. I forced myself to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection. The man looking back at me was a ghost haunting his own life. The drive back to Boston passed in a blur. By the time I reached my apartment, the sterile place that had become my refuge since Kathleen started spending all her time in Vermont, it was nearly midnight. Sleep was impossible. Instead, I sat at my computer and began researching Richard Thomas. The basic search results looked perfect. LinkedIn profile showing Cornell MBA and a career in international consulting. Tasteful Facebook with photos from exotic locations. Mentions in local Vermont newspapers about community involvement. But I'd spent 30 years analyzing financial statements and risk profiles. I knew how to spot inconsistencies. And Richard Thomas's digital footprint had holes you could drive a truck through. I logged into the professional databases my firm subscribed to. TLOXP, LexisNexis, the tools we used for due diligence on major clients. What I found made my blood run cold. The Social Security number associated with Richard Thomas belonged to a man who died in a car accident in 1996. The employment history had gaps that didn't make sense. Tax returns showed income patterns that were completely inconsistent with someone who'd supposedly retired from international consulting. At 4 a.m, I found something that changed everything. A lawsuit filed in New Hampshire in 2019 mentioning Richard A. Thomas in a real estate fraud case. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but the plaintiff's name was there in black and white, Patricia Wayne. I started a new search, this time for Patricia Wayne. What I found kept me awake for the next 3 hours. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in the office of Sarah Mitchell, the private investigator my lawyer had recommended. She was a small, precise woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I think my wife is having an affair," I began. "No," Sarah interrupted, spreading out the photos I'd provided. "Your wife isn't having an affair. She's robbing you. And the man she's with is a professional." She pulled out a thick file folder. "I started preliminary research after your lawyer called yesterday. The man you know as Richard Thomas is actually Robert Caldwell, aged 44, originally from Michigan. He has a criminal record dating back to his 20s, identity theft, fraud, forgery, and he's been running sophisticated romance scams across New England for at least a decade." Sarah opened the file, showing me photographs. 3 different women, all elegant, well-dressed, middle-aged, all smiling at the camera with Robert Caldwell by their sides, though he looked slightly different in each photo, different hair color, different style, but unmistakably the same man. "Sandra Foster from Maine lost her house and life savings before she figured out what was happening," Sarah explained. "She tried to press charges, but Caldwell had already moved on. Patricia Wayne from New Hampshire actually married him before discovering the truth. She's still fighting to recover her assets." She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a woman who looked remarkably similar to Kathleen. Dark hair, refined features, the kind of elegant beauty that suggested education and social status. Jennifer Rothschild from Massachusetts. She was a widow with substantial assets. Caldwell convinced her to transfer ownership of her late husband's real estate portfolio to him for tax purposes. By the time she realized what had happened, he'd sold everything and disappeared. "And my wife?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be worse. Sarah's expression grew grave. "Your wife's case is different, Mr. Thomas. In the previous instances, Caldwell targeted women who were isolated, widows, divorcees, women with few close family connections. But you're still legally married. You're still in the picture. That makes you an obstacle," I finished. Sarah nodded slowly. "I need you to understand something very important. In 2 of Caldwell's previous cases, the victims' former partners died in what appeared to be accidents shortly before the financial transfers were completed. A car crash in Maine, a drowning in New Hampshire. Both deaths removed the last potential obstacles to his plans." The room seemed to tilt around me. "You think they're planning to kill me?" "I think your wife's level of cooperation in this scheme suggests planning that goes beyond simple financial fraud. The forged documents, the systematic erasure of your presence, the elaborate cover story. These aren't the actions of a woman who's been manipulated. These are the actions of someone actively participating in making you disappear." Over the next 3 days, Sarah's investigation uncovered the timeline of my own destruction. 3 years ago, I'd given Kathleen the Vermont house. Our marriage had already been strained. I'd spent decades building my consulting career, traveling constantly, missing Scott's baseball games and Courtney's recitals. When the kids left for college, Kathleen and I had become strangers sharing a house. 2 years ago, Kathleen met Robert at an art gallery in Burlington. He'd posed as Richard Thomas, a recently widowed collector who appreciated her work. Unlike me, always busy, always distracted, Richard had given her complete attention. The affair started 18 months ago. But it wasn't just an affair. Sarah had obtained phone records showing hundreds of calls between Kathleen and Robert. She'd accessed cloud backups of deleted emails that painted a damning picture. At first, Robert had played the sympathetic ear. "You deserve someone who sees you. Demetrio takes you for granted. Imagine a life without financial stress." Then, 12 months ago, things escalated. Robert claimed he had financial troubles and suggested they could start over together. But they needed money. Kathleen's response, preserved in an email that made me physically ill. "What if we could access Demetrio's assets? He never pays attention anyway. He wouldn't even notice." Robert had initially played reluctant, but eventually agreed to help with legal transfers. The forged signatures started 8 months ago. Kathleen had practiced my signature hundreds of times. Sarah found the practice sheets in a cloud backup. Bank security footage showed Kathleen signing documents as my attorney-in-fact using forged powers of attorney. But the worst discovery came from wiretap recordings the FBI had obtained as part of their existing investigation into Robert Caldwell. Sarah had contacts in the bureau who'd shared key excerpts, Robert's voice. "If Demetrio discovers what we've done, we could both go to prison." A long pause, then Kathleen's voice. "Then we need to make sure he doesn't discover it." "Robert, there are ways to handle this permanently. Would you be comfortable with that?" Kathleen, barely audible. "I don't want to know the details. Just make it look natural." I listened to that recording 3 times, each time hoping I'd heard wrong. But there was no mistaking the meaning. My wife had consented to my murder. "There's more," Sarah said on the 4th day. "Caldwell has already identified his next target." She showed me a file on Dorothy Pearson, a 70-year-old widow from Newport who'd inherited a $4.2 million estate from her late husband. Robert had contacted her 3 weeks ago as Richard Donovan, a widower whose wife had died in a car accident. The FBI wants to use Mrs. Pearson's case to finally arrest Caldwell, Sarah explained. She's agreed to cooperate and wear a wire. They're planning to arrest him when he attempts the fraud this Friday. And Kathleen? They'll arrest her simultaneously. They have enough evidence for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and accessory to attempted murder. I should have felt relief. Justice was coming, but all I felt was empty. "I want to confront her first," I said. Before the arrest, I want her to know that I know. Sarah frowned. That's dangerous. If she panics— I've been a ghost in my own life for months, I interrupted. Before this ends, I need her to see that ghost come back. The next week was spent building an airtight case. Forensic accountants documented every fraudulent transfer. $847,000 moved from my accounts. Security footage from 3 different banks showed Kathleen signing my name. Email chains detailed the planning. Text messages discussed the Demetrio problem. But the most damning evidence came from Kathleen's laptop. Her search history told a chilling story. Untraceable poisons, staged car accidents, life insurance payout timelines. A forensic accountant also discovered something crucial. Kathleen had opened a secret account in the Cayman Islands 14 months ago, 3 months before the first forged signature. This wasn't an impulsive affair spiraling out of control. This was premeditated theft. By Thursday, everything was ready. Dorothy Pearson would meet Richard Donovan Friday evening in Newport. FBI agents would arrest him there. Other agents would arrest Kathleen in Vermont. But I'd made one modification to the plan. Friday morning, before Robert's arrest, I would drive to Vermont. Sarah had agreed only because I'd wear a wire and have plainclothes agents nearby. Thursday night, I couldn't sleep. I wrote letters to Scott and Courtney to be delivered only if something went wrong, explaining everything. I looked at old family photos, searching for the moment when Kathleen had started to disappear, when I'd stopped seeing her. Maybe that was the real tragedy. I'd been so focused on my career, on providing financially, that I'd failed to notice my wife becoming invisible in our own marriage. That didn't excuse what she'd done. Consent to murder could never be excused, but it helped me understand how we'd arrived at this moment. At dawn Friday, I stood in my apartment, looking at the sunrise over Boston. This would be the last day of my old life. Whatever happened in Vermont, I could never go back to the man I'd been. That man was already dead. Kathleen had killed him months ago. Now it was time for the ghost to return. The drive to Vermont on Friday morning felt different from every other time I'd made this journey. There was no anticipation, no hope for reconciliation, just cold determination and the slight weight of the wire taped to my chest beneath my shirt. Sarah had insisted on 3 conditions. I'd wear the recording device, plainclothes FBI agents would be positioned within 200 yards of the property, and I'd have an emergency signal, 3 rapid taps on my phone screen if things turned dangerous. As I approached the gate, I didn't slow down. I'd never changed the access code, betting that Kathleen wouldn't think to either. I was right. The gate swung open when I entered the 6 digits, our wedding anniversary, a date that apparently still served some purpose in her fraudulent life. James Rodriguez looked up from the groundskeeper's cottage, confusion crossing his face as he recognized my car. He started toward me, but I was already past, driving up the familiar path to the house. Kathleen was in the garden, tending to roses in the morning sunlight. She wore a white sundress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like a painting, beautiful, serene, untouchable. For a moment, I almost couldn't reconcile this elegant woman with the voice on those recordings, casually discussing my murder. Kathleen. She turned, garden shears in hand. The first expression was confusion. Then recognition hit her like a physical blow. The shears fell to the ground, and all the color drained from her face. Demetrio. My name came out as barely a whisper. Yes, I said calmly, walking closer. Your husband. The man you planned to kill. No, this isn't— She stepped backward, her hand instinctively moving to her throat. Where's Richard? I asked. Or should I call him Robert? Robert Caldwell, the serial con artist you've been helping to steal my life? Her legs seemed to give out. She sank onto a garden bench, shaking her head frantically. When did you— I came here weeks ago, I said. Pretended to be a potential buyer named David Morrison. You looked me right in the eye, Kathleen. 23 years of marriage and you didn't even recognize your own husband. Tears started streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. These weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic at being caught. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she finally managed. You were never supposed to find out. Find out that you were planning to murder me? No, I imagine you wanted that to stay secret. It's not what you think. She stood up, desperation in her voice. Robert said we could just disappear, start over somewhere else. He said you'd be better off without me anyway. Did he also tell you about Sandra Foster, Patricia Wayne, Jennifer Rothschild? I watched her face carefully. The other women he scammed? Or the men who died in accidents before he could complete those scams? Pure shock replaced the panic. What? No. Robert said, Robert is a serial criminal, Kathleen, and you're his accomplice. I pulled out my phone, playing one of the recordings Sarah had provided. Robert's voice filled the garden, smooth and manipulative, coaching someone, another victim, using the exact same phrases he'd used on my wife. Then I played the recording that mattered most. Robert's voice. There are ways to handle this permanently. And Kathleen's response, I don't want to know the details, just make it look natural. Her face crumbled as she heard her own words. I didn't mean, you absolutely meant it. My voice was steady, surgical. You practiced my signature for months. You transferred nearly $1 million. You cut me out of our wedding photo, and you agreed to my murder. I was angry. The words exploded out of her. Do you understand that? I was so angry at you. The sudden fury in her voice stopped me cold. Angry about what? I asked. About everything. She was standing now, 20 years of resentment pouring out. About Scott's entire childhood while you were building your career. About every recital you missed, every parent-teacher conference I attended alone, every night I put our children to bed by myself while you were in some hotel in Chicago or New York or God knows where. Her voice broke, but she kept going. I raised 2 children alone, Demetrio. You were there for birthdays and Christmas, but I was there for everything else. The nightmares, the homework struggles, the teenage heartbreaks, I handled all of it. And when they finally grew up and left, when I finally thought maybe you'd have time for me? She laughed bitterly. You bought me this house like it was some kind of trophy for good behavior. Here, Kathleen, have this lovely prison where you can be alone even more. You gave me space when all I wanted was for you to see me. The words hit harder than I'd expected, because underneath all the fraud and betrayal, there was truth there. I had been absent. I had prioritized work over family. I'd taken her for granted. So Robert showed up, she continued, her voice softer now. And he listened. He saw me. For the first time in years, I felt like I mattered to someone. And when he suggested we could have a different life together, she trailed off. I wasn't thinking about right or wrong. I was just thinking that finally someone was choosing me. We stood there in the garden I'd paid for, surrounded by flowers I'd never helped plant, and I understood, really understood, how we'd arrived at this moment. You could have divorced me, Kathleen, I said quietly. You could have taken half of everything legally. You would have been wealthy, free, and you wouldn't be going to prison. I know. Her voice was barely audible. I know that now. But Robert said divorce would be complicated, that lawyers would take years, that you'd fight it. He made the other way seem so easy, so clean. And I was so angry that I convinced myself you deserved it. Did I deserve to die? The question hung between us. Kathleen opened her mouth, then closed it. What answer could there possibly be? My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Caldwell apprehended, moving to arrest Kathleen now. Kathleen saw my expression change. What's happening? Robert was arrested in Newport 10 minutes ago, I said. He was attempting to defraud a 70-year-old widow named Dorothy Pearson. The FBI has everything on tape, the fraud attempt, his real identity, his entire criminal history. No, she shook her head, but I could see the realization dawning. No, that's not possible, and they're coming for you now. 2 black SUVs appeared at the end of the driveway. Federal agents emerged, moving with practiced efficiency. Amanda Foster, the prosecutor Sarah had introduced me to, led the group. Kathleen Thomas, Amanda said, approaching with handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and accessory to attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights continued, Kathleen looked at me one last time. Not with anger or defiance, but with something that looked almost like relief, as if after months of living in an elaborate lie, the truth, even terrible truth, was a kind of freedom. I'm sorry, she whispered as they led her toward the SUV. I'm so sorry, Demetrio. I watched them put her in the vehicle, watched them drive away with the woman I'd been married to for 23 years, and I realized something profound. I was sorry too. Sorry for the years of neglect, sorry for not seeing her disappear long before Robert Caldwell showed up, sorry that we'd both been so lost that theft and murder had seemed like viable options. James Rodriguez approached hesitantly. "Mr. Thomas, I didn't know. She told me—" "I know what she told you," I said, not unkindly. "You were doing your job. None of this is your fault." As I walked through the house one last time, collecting the forged documents the FBI would need for evidence, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but exhaustion. Justice was coming, but it wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't restore the years we'd lost or heal the wounds we'd inflicted on each other. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Boston, watching Kathleen stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish her somehow. She looked smaller, older, as if prison had already begun erasing the elegant woman she'd been. Scott sat beside me, his jaw tight with emotion. Courtney was on my other side, holding my hand. They'd flown in from London and California for the sentencing, devastated by their mother's choices but determined to support their father. Robert Caldwell had been sentenced the previous month, 28 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Evidence had also emerged linking him to the suspicious deaths in Maine and New Hampshire. Murder charges were pending. For Kathleen, the prosecution had offered a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation. She'd taken it. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, how does the defendant plead? The judge asked. Guilty, Your Honor. Kathleen's voice was barely audible. On the charge of identity theft? Guilty. The accessory to murder charge had been dropped. Evidence showed she hadn't known about Robert's history of violence, but that didn't erase what she'd done. Judge Morrison, no relation to my fake alias, looked at Kathleen with an expression that mixed sternness with something almost like sympathy. Mrs. Thomas, I've reviewed your case extensively. I've read the psychological evaluation, the letters from your children, and the statement from your husband. You were clearly manipulated by a sophisticated predator. But you were also a willing participant in a scheme that caused immeasurable harm to someone who trusted you. The judge paused, then continued. Your actions were driven by resentment rather than necessity, by anger rather than desperation. While I acknowledge the neglect you experienced in your marriage, the law provides remedies for such situations. You chose crime instead. On all counts, I sentence you to 10 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after 7 years, followed by 3 years supervised release. Kathleen's shoulders shook, but she didn't cry. As the bailiff led her away, she turned to look at our children, mouthing, "I love you" to them. Then her eyes found mine. There was no anger there, no blame, just acknowledgement of everything we'd lost. Scott and Courtney broke down as their mother disappeared through the door. I held them both. These adult children suddenly reduced to confusion and grief. They'd lost their mother, not to death, but to choices neither of them could understand. She loved you both, I told them. Whatever else happened, she loved you both completely. Never doubt that. 3 months after the trial, I stood in the Vermont house for the last time before closing. A young couple with 2 small children had bought it, Sarah and Tom Richardson. They were excited about raising our family in such a beautiful place. The FBI had recovered 94% of the stolen assets. The Vermont property, the transferred funds, most of the liquidated investments. But some things couldn't be recovered. Trust, 23 years of shared history, the belief that the person sleeping beside you actually knew you. I'd already sold the Boston condo. Too many ghosts, too many memories of the life that had turned out to be fiction. My new home was a modest cabin in Asheville, North Carolina. A place where no one knew me, where I could rebuild without the weight of the past. 6 months after the trial, I sat on my cabin's porch watching the sunset over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The silence was complete, except for birdsong and the rustle of leaves. My phone rang. Sarah Mitchell. Just wanted to check in, she said. How are you settling in? Good, I said, surprised to realize it was true. Actually good. I'm glad. Listen, I have a proposal. My firm is expanding, and we're looking for someone with your financial background to consult on fraud cases, particularly romance scams. Would you be interested? I thought about Dorothy Pearson, the 70-year-old widow we'd saved from Robert's scheme. I thought about the other potential victims out there, being targeted by predators who saw vulnerable people as opportunities. Yes, I said. I think I would be. After we hung up, I thought about purpose. For 30 years, I'd worked to build wealth, to provide security for my family, but I'd been so focused on the providing that I'd forgotten the family part. Now I had a chance to do something that mattered in a different way, to help people avoid the kind of destruction that had nearly consumed me. My neighbor, Helen Carpenter, waved from her garden next door. "Demetrio, we're having a potluck tomorrow night. You should come." A month ago, I would have made excuses. Old habits die hard, but I was learning to say yes to connection, yes to community, yes to being present in my own life. "I'd love to," I called back. That evening, I called Scott. Tiffany answered, excitement in her voice. "Demetrio, perfect timing. Scott was just about to call you." Scott got on the line and I could hear the smile. "Dad, we have news. Tiffany's pregnant. You're going to be a grandfather." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then, "That's wonderful. That's when?" "June. And Dad, we want you very involved. I know you missed a lot with Courtney and me growing up, but you're here now. That's what matters." After we hung up, I sat on the porch as darkness fell, watching stars emerge in the Carolina sky. The same stars that shone over Vermont, over Boston, over every place I'd ever been. But tonight, they felt different. They felt like promise. Kathleen was in prison, serving time for choices that had destroyed our marriage and nearly destroyed me. Robert Caldwell would likely die behind bars. The life I'd built over decades had been revealed as an elaborate fiction. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of change. I thought about my grandchild, due in June. I'd have a second chance, not to undo the past, but to be present for the future, to show up not just financially, but emotionally, to be the grandfather I should have been a father. For the first time in months, I felt something that resembled hope. I'd been a ghost in my own life, invisible to my wife, absent from my children's daily existence. But ghosts can't hold babies, or attend birthday parties, or be present for the small, vital moments that actually matter. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was alive, present, free. And that was worth more than any house in Vermont, any amount of recovered assets, any version of the life I'd lost. Tomorrow, I'd go to Helen's potluck. Next week, I'd start consulting for Sarah's firm. In June, I'd fly to London to meet my grandchild. One day at a time, one choice at a time, I was building a life that was real. The ghost had returned, and this time he was determined to stay.